Hi people. So this video is a bit different for me. It's not the sort of topic I usually discuss, but I think it's quite interesting and watching the show just kind of made me think it would be a good idea to talk about. I'm referring to this show, Humans. That's just the DVD box cover, Humans. This was broadcast in 2015 and it actually had three series. 2015, the second series was 2016, and then 2018, I believe. I didn't actually see, just a caveat, I didn't see the second series and the third series. And I'm trying to recall how I actually saw this, if it was streaming service online or something. Because I rarely watch things on television. I don't have the discipline to tune in at the right time. I've always got other distractions. But for whatever reason, I bought the DVD in CEX, and I really liked the show. I remember it being advertised at the time on the London Underground. It's actually Anglo-American uh, version of 2012 Swedish series called Real Humans, and the shows are pretty similar. I haven't seen the Swedish version, so I can't comment on it. I know the creator of that was disappointed that the original wasn't broadcast in the UK. Um, but very loosely speaking, I'll just say the synopsis very loosely. Spoiler here, obviously. But then I want to talk more about the issues around this that the show raises, really robo-ethics. The idea of that basically artificial intelligence there could be a red line or a grey line even in terms of what we regard as human ethics. So before I get into that, just a very brief synopsis of the show. Basically, it's set in Britain in the near future, no specific year given, but we assume it's in the near future. I'm guessing probably the 2030s. It stars Gemma Chan, who is on the box there, um, and also in other supporting roles. There isn't really a main character, but she was used in most of the marketing. Um, Tom Goodman Hill. Let's see who else we have. Morgan of Merlin fame. Um, Catherine Parkinson. I'm just naming some random actors here. The late William Hurt, the American actor, had an important role. Um, who else we have? Like I said, I'm just naming some random characters, some random cast members. Emily Barrington and Jack Burgess, uh, Sophie Dirisu. So if you know any of these actors, you might like the show. I haven't seen the second and third series, so I can't comment on them. But I really enjoyed this first series. Basically, the principle of this program is the show is in this near future situation, synthetic humans, that is to say, humanoid robots with highly developed artificial intelligence, are being utilized in society for all sorts of purposes. Commercially, they're being bought by households, and the show actually, the first episode, focuses on the Hawkins family, just a regular middle class family. The father basically buys a synth, so they're abbreviated as synthetic humans in the show, as portrayed by Gemma Chan. And although fundamentally she's a robot, it's a robot. They are strikingly realistic looking, and that's a big part of the whole angle to this. But basically, they're bought to help with household tasks and everyday things, and they have everything a human can do with more strength, but without human emotions. Um, I think there's a term, uncanny valley. It's quite an old term. It goes back to the 50s, I believe, and it's this idea that I think it's also used with large primates. Some people feel uncomfortable around gorillas and chimpanzees because their DNA is so similar to humans. But basically, it's this idea that if an artificially intelligent synthetic robot is so realistic that it looks like a person, it makes a lot of people feel very uncomfortable. We often think of Japan and South Korea for developing this sort of stuff, and it's those countries are probably well ahead. They're already used in, I think, in limited capacity in some teaching, and certainly as waiters, servers, as Americans would say, in the catering industry. But it's still not like certainly not to the extent that's shown in this show. But basically, Anita is her name. She's a she seems like a normal simp at first, but then she starts saying things, and there's little things that makes the mother of the family suspicious. Hawkins have a strained relationship. The mother's a lawyer, father don't know what he does, but they're feeling strained. The mother's feeling pushed out by the simp. She doesn't trust it. Um, the father, obviously, the episode I've just watched, and again, the spoilers here, he basically initiates adult mode because he's feeling estranged from his wife and he wants to experiment. Their teenage son has a crush on it. Their teenage daughter is a hacker and she doesn't trust simps. There's all these different sort of components. I personally thought the character development was good in the show. That's one story. It's sort of the central story at the beginning, but there's all sorts of other storylines going on. There's a special force police officer who really doesn't like simps and his disabled wife, and he have to use one temporarily, but he really doesn't trust them. And then in the backdrop, you develop there's this sort of backstory where one synth played by Colin Morgan, who's remarkably human-like. Like he's basically 99% human. At least that's how he comes across. But he is part synth. Is trying to track down his sort of group, which includes Gemma Chan's former synth. So rather than being a new synth, she is actually an older model by the name of Mia, whose memory has been wiped. Um, it's a little bit complex if I get into all the different storylines because there's about, I reckon, 4 or 5 different little subplots going on. But the overall arch of this is the role of these machines essentially in society. What is the role? What is it, a good or a bad thing? And the episode I've just watched, it was episode 4. Again, spoiler here. It shows a sort of underground movement developing of humans who deeply resent these machines, and they sort of organize this sort of bit bit dark actually. This not Fight Club, but this big warehouse where they basically destroying these machines for fun, but there's also a political motive there that they feel that they're taking over society. Like you say, the teenage daughter of the family resents them, the mother doesn't trust them. Um, Different attitude with males in the family. The teenage son has a crush on her. It's a rather amusing scene where she's sort of in sleeping mode and he goes to basically touch her inappropriately and she comes awake and tells him, inappropriate contact is not permitted for non-primary users, and it's obviously it embarrasses this teenage boy. Then he says, "Why do they have to make you so fit?" It's quite a humorous scene. There's also William Hurt's character is a scientist who suffers from some level of dementia and the side effect of a stroke. He also knows something's going on. He is put with a very controlling Nurse Ratchet type synth, which he resents. But he has a sort of fatherly relationship with a former synth. Now, on the surface, it might sound a bit daft, but it's actually a pretty engaging show, and I wish I'd seen the second and third series. And it was relatively successful. I wouldn't say it was super successful. I hope I can somehow find the second and third series. But anyway, that's the basic premise. And I think the show raises lots of interesting questions. One of that group that I mentioned, headed by Colin Morgan, is a simp called Niska. She's a very important character because, again, she's very much lifelike. Anita's character is much more simp-like, but there's little human elements coming through. The characters Simps played by Colin Morgan, and I think the actress is um, C. Bennington. I don't know all of these actors to be honest. It was only Gemma Chan, William Hurt, and Colin Morgan I knew as actors. Anyway, I'll just call her the blonde simp because I don't remember off the top of my head the actress's name, Niska. She's basically working in the adult industry. She's basically a synthetic prostitute. But because she's got a strong human component, it's a disturbing scene where this old guy comes in and he clearly has predatory instincts because he wants her to pretend to be a frightened young girl. And she turns on him and she's got a violent streak. And but basically, this is a simp with a conscience. She's on a warpath against humanity. Basically, it's But analogies with Terminator isn't quite justified, so I won't make them. But it gets into a question of this technology is developing. We're hearing all the time now about artificial intelligence and where it can go. I watched a film last night with Sandra Bullock, The Net, and that was when the internet was still relatively in its infancy, 1995. And to look at, that, it seems like the dark ages now. It's 28 years ago. And now, the sort of things that are portrayed in this, although it hasn't quite happened yet, it's not inconceivable. And that's what I liked about the show. It's not some, distant dystopian future. It's the near future. It's very conceivable in maybe 10 years. I don't think it'll necessarily be mass produced that way. And goodness knows they'll cost a lot, I imagine. But it gets into moral questions and this subject of robo-ethics. So what I want to raise is there such a thing? Is there this idea that there's a red line of, because we think of human rights, we think of what rights humans have. Well, it's the right to live in safety, it's the right to due process if you're accused of crime, it's the right to not be tortured, it's the right to an education, all of these things, right? Um, but the fundamental point about a machine is it has no human conscience. How can it have human rights? And that's where some would dismiss the whole idea of robo-ethics. But there's an interesting scene, I think it's the episode I've just watched, which shows some teenagers at a party, including the Hawkins children, and some of the boys there basically have a female synth, and, well, basically, being teenage boys, they want to um, mess around with it, but they're doing it in a very misogynistic sort of way. And the teenage daughter of the family, like I say, she's a hacker. She gets angry with that. And one of the boys said, it's just a machine. And the thing is, technically, he's right. But it sort of makes you think, well, is this how they might actually think about real women? Like, they actually want to do this to real women. So, and there's another scene where Anita, this is Gemma Chan's synth, is damaged because she saves the teenage son in a road accident. And in order to repair her, the father has to kind of artificially insert the new chip into her, which means she has to be naked, basically. And he's just feeling uneasy about this because I think, like his son, he's attracted to it because his marriage is estranged, but he has a guilty conscience because he's a married man, even though this is fundamentally a machine. Again, it gets into these ethical questions, and he basically had sex with it, and you could tell he's feeling guilty, and yet it's a machine. But it makes me think of these synthetic dolls that you actually can buy commercially. And there was a Japanese film called Air Doll. Although that was very much like a doll rather than a synth. But there's all sorts of questions around this. I mean, if something is made by people, if it's artificially designed, if it's basically a highly intelligent machine, is there really a moral argument to be made that, oh, you're hurting it, or its feelings should be respected if it doesn't have feelings. But then if it's developed to such an extent that it can register the sense of human feelings, then it gets into quite a grey area. I don't know. I mean, I think that in the future it's possible that there'll be a lot of areas where these machines will be developed more. Dangerous industries, for example, mining, um, power lines, oil rigs, that sort of thing, which are dangerous. But then, whenever there's a transition in any industry, and we see this throughout history, there's always discontent from those in the existing industry, even if it does have safety issues. But we hear things like child miners in the Congo, um, sweatshop laborers in Bangladesh. What if in the future Simp's done all of that? But it's like any new development, it's money, it's the supply and demand side of things. Um, I think there may well be an argument for it. But I would say the same about this as I would about technology in general. We can never ever replace humanity. And I do think sometimes today we're overly reliant on technology. Everything is smartphones and laptops and it's a digital world. And I think sometimes too much so. It's an interesting thing. At one point, Dr. Millikan, played by William Hurt, phoned up the helpline, And of course, he says, "Oh, you're one of them, aren't you?" And he's talking to a synth. But we're already seeing that with automated messages. You try to complain to a company about something, it'll be an automated message. That annoys the hell out of me because they cannot read into the nuances of a situation. And this is the problem with technology. So synths in the show, they can, register a lot of situations, but they can't quite get nuance. They can register human emotions to an extent, but not nuances. And that's something that would either need to develop more, or the question is, should it develop more? Um, I mean, in the human world, if you're frustrated with, say, let's say you're in an airport and the plane is delayed, the human component of things would be the fed up passenger might lose their temper with the airline assistant, but the airline assistant's a human being, and they, at some point, they don't deserve to get all the heat from the customers. So then the question is, well, if that's a synth, and it's sorting the problem out, the passengers can vent the frustration, but there's no human component there of the person who's being abused at work. So there's questions like this. Catering, I've been a waiter, it's not a fun job. Um, I don't know. I think it's a very interesting subject potentially. Um, and there's another thing, we're hearing that people might think we're going totally left field with this, but there's all sorts of issues in human society to think about. In recent years, we've heard a lot about so-called incel community, that is, frustrated young men who blame women for their lack of sexual experience, sometimes in very misogynistic ways. Well, what if people who struggle with loneliness and they just had no other feasible way of getting human contact or intimacy? What if in the future simps were the answer? I'm asking that in all seriousness. I personally think it would be a sad indictment of human society, but loneliness is one of the biggest causes of depression. And it is not an easy thing to solve. The obvious answer is, improve your social life. But I know from experience, dating sites are a flipping headache. They don't necessarily solve that problem. Social life, you need to find it. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, a lonely person, or maybe someone whose social life was limited, perhaps from a disability or another reason. Maybe they're a widow or a widower. You know, what if they were to buy a synth and the synth kept them company? Yes, it just kept them company. I'm not necessarily talking sex, but it kept them company. So it was developed to such an extent that it had pretty much all the human components. But people might say, well, Nathan, that's very Orwellian, that should be a real person doing that. But the world's not idealistic. We know that people are going through loneliness. So if the world was ideal, then everyone who's lonely, everyone who's struggling with that could just get another person. But we know it doesn't work that way. So maybe there's an argument to be made because um, then there's another component even to that when we're talking about human relations. Say you get predatory relationships, let's just say it, pedophiles and so on. Um, would there then be questions of, well, could you get a predator who would order an underage synth, that looked like a little girl or a little boy? I think most people would say that's creepy and weird. Even if it is technically a machine, it's still insinuating what that person is thinking. So as it stands, there are anonymous programs that they can contact, and there's even in some countries they have, um, there's a word for it, where they know they killed their sex drive. I forget the term that's used now. Um, some say they can't be cured, but in that situation, people might say, well, you give them that sort of symptom, it's only encouraging the behavior. And what's to stop them going to a real human child and preying on them? So I think there's a lot of there are ethical questions around this, but I think the idea that there's robo-ethics in terms of machines have rights, at this point it's absurd because they don't have a heart, they don't have a brain, they don't have the development of human conscience. Conscience is the key issue here. They can work out complicated maths problems, they can do tasks, they can do all of that, but without that sensation of consciousness of right and wrong, or maybe they're even programmed to tell right from wrong. So, for example, in the show, the character Anita, she is programmed to protect the vulnerable little girl in the family. Um, and there's one point where the little girl begs her to hug her, and she sort of puts her arm around her almost like a mother would, yet she's fundamentally a machine. So, if nothing else, the show raises a lot of interesting questions. Let me know your thoughts. Do you think in the future this sort of technology will develop? I'm not necessarily talking exactly like a show like synthetic humans, but basically artificial intelligence in this sense. And is it a good thing or a bad thing? I'm somewhere in the middle. I'll be honest, maybe 15 years ago I would have been dead set against it. I would have said, no, no, the human world can never be replaced. But let's face it, human beings are flawed. And something like, I come back to this issue of loneliness and depression. You might argue that a synthetic man or woman could never replace a real thing. But if it was developed to such an extent that it could, who's to say that if an adult was to get an adult synth and what they want with them, it's and that synth had everything except the conscience. I don't know. And the question is that really solving the problem of loneliness? Because that person would be thinking, no matter how human-like it looks, this thing doesn't have, it's not really, really, really registering my, my love, my intimacy, my whatever. So it might never resolve the problem. In which case, it comes back to the question, maybe human society just needs to improve. Maybe we need to find better ways of or more practical ways of dealing with human loneliness. Like you say, dating sites are. This video is not about that, but it's one of those things, that a lot of people go to because they're single. But dating sites, you have to put up with. This is the counter argument. A synth wouldn't, ghost someone. A synth wouldn't have an affair. A synth wouldn't. There wouldn't be those negative components of what humans do unless they're designed that way, unless they're manipulated that way. So anyway, this is a little bit longer than I intended. I think it's an interesting subject. If you know the program since, excuse me, humans, what do you think of it? If you've seen the second and third series, don't tell me too much because I haven't seen them yet. 2015, it's a reboot of a Swedish series. I think it's an interesting subject. And I am somewhere in the middle. I think that they could definitely be utilized for some positive purposes, but we always, always need to be careful with new technology. And I do think that it would be a very sad thing if human beings were so reliant on technology that we forgot the natural world, the real world. So I always say, I'm recording this video at night time, but if you're watching this during the day, after this, go and browse the internet a bit more, whatever you're doing. But go for a walk. Bring your keys, bring your phone if you need to, but go for a walk. Just get in fresh air, experience the real world. It's very, very important. Because I do think one thing I think would be very depressing is if the world became too reliant on technology. That wouldn't be a good thing. I think that would destroy our humanity. So that's my thoughts. Let me know what you think of robo-ethics and the use of AI.